Okay, so this is the first video case brief for justifications under self-defense and the reasonable belief requirement. So we're going to talk about United States versus Peterson, and along the way there will be some questions embedded in the video that you'll answer, and I'll take a look at those answers to just spot check how everybody's doing on reading the cases. Okay, so first a note about jurisdiction on this case. Washington, D.C. did not have its own felony courts at the time that Peterson was indicted. And so you may have wondered, why is it that a second-degree murder case is taking place in federal court? Because generally, murders don't get tried in federal court. Usually that's a state crime. So at the time, felonies were prosecuted by the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia in the District Court for the District of Columbia. So that's federal district court, and they were prosecuted by the U.S. Attorney's Office, and the prosecutions were all funded by the U.S. government. Currently, felonies are prosecuted in the Criminal Division of the District of Columbia Superior Court as part of D.C.'s continued effort to expand its ability for home rule. Okay, so United States versus Peterson. This is from the D.C. Circuit in 1973. So the D.C. Circuit is the intermediate appellate court for the District of Columbia, or for the D.C. Circuit, I guess. Case facts. Okay, so Peterson discovered Mr. Kite stealing his windshield wipers from his car in the alley behind his house. Peterson confronted Kite. They argued. Peterson returned back to his house and came back outside with a gun. Right as Peterson was coming back outside, Kite was about to drive off, and Peterson threatened to kill Kite. Well, Kite got out of his car, no longer ready to drive off, with a lug wrench. Peterson warned him not to come any closer, but Kite continued moving forward, but still within the alley. He was in the alley the entire time. Peterson, who was in his yard, shot and killed Kite. So here's what happened in court. Peterson was indicted for second-degree murder. Peterson then sought a judgment of acquittal, which was denied. So a request for a judgment of acquittal happens before there's a jury verdict, where the prosecution has given all of its evidence, and the defendant can ask for, it's basically like a directed verdict, like the equivalent of that in civil court, but it's a directed verdict of acquittal. So he was saying to the judge, they haven't proven their case, therefore you should go ahead and just give me a judgment of acquittal and not send it to the jury. And the judge said no, which the judge almost always says. And so the judge went ahead and instructed the jury on self-defense. And you guys have probably noticed that a lot of these cases come up with jury instructions, because what happens is the judge instructs the jury about the law, and then when the defendant, or if the defendant is convicted, one of the errors that the defendant can allege on appeal is that the judge got the law wrong when it instructed the jury. Therefore, the jury couldn't have come to a correct decision because it was using the wrong law that was given to it by the judge. So these were the instructions that the jury, that the jury received on self-defense. First of all, self-defense is not available to justify killing if the defendant provoked the altercation, although words alone are usually not enough provocation to strip the aggressor, or to strip the defendant of his right of self-defense. Second, even if the defendant provoked the fight, self-defense can still be available if he withdrew from the conflict in good faith, not goof faith, and communicated that to the victim. Third, while a defendant does not have a duty to retreat, the jury could consider whether the defendant could safely retreat in deciding whether he behaved reasonably. So the court talks a lot throughout the opinion about defenses of necessity, meaning you can't create your own necessity. The necessity has to be created or foisted upon you by the situation. Therefore, if you create your own necessity to use self-defense and deadly force by provoking a confrontation, or once provoking it, not withdrawing from the confrontation, then self-defense isn't available to you because you don't really need a defense. It's no longer a defense of necessity. It's sort of a defense of luxury at that point. So the jury found Peterson guilty of manslaughter, which is a lesser included offense, of course, of second-degree murder. And then Peterson appealed, arguing that the judge had instructed the jury incorrectly. So the judge defined self-defense the wrong way to the jury. Therefore, that's why the jury convicted him, because they didn't have the right definition of self-defense. So the issues in this case, there are two primary issues. The first one is, can the initial aggressor in a deadly conflict invoke self-defense to justify the killing? The second issue is, does the initial aggressor have to retreat before using deadly force in self-defense? So the rules that the court articulated, for the first one who is the aggressor in a conflict culminating in death cannot invoke the necessities of self-preservation only in the event that he communicates to his adversary his intent to withdraw, and in good faith attempts to do so, is he restored to his right of self-defense. So basically, if you are the aggressor, you can't claim self-defense unless you have withdrawn in good faith and communicated that to the other person. So that's the rule for the first issue. And then the court announces several retreat rules. The first one is the minority view, which also happens to be the view that D.C. courts seem to take on this, and that is that self-defense requires safe retreat when possible. Retreat is not required if it's going to be dangerous. The goal is not to put the defendant in greater harm, or the person who's being attacked in greater harm. If they can safely retreat, they should do that. If retreat is dangerous, of course, it's not required. Then there's the majority view that allows one to stand his ground or stand your ground and use deadly force when it's necessary. And so that is the majority view, but the court points out that this does not seem to be the view that D.C. law subscribes to. Then finally, there's the castle doctrine. The castle doctrine says that when one is attacked in his home, he's not under any duty to retreat. The problem with the castle doctrine for Peterson is that that's unavailable to the aggressor. And so you don't have to retreat if you're attacked in your own home, but you can't have provoked the conflict and then not retreat. Again, that goes along with, you can't create your own necessity and then take advantage of a necessity defense. So the application of these rules to Peterson's facts, the court's rationale for its conclusion. Peterson was the aggressor when he came outside with his gun. Therefore, he lost his right to claim self-defense at that point. Because he never communicated through words or actions an intent to withdraw from the confrontation, he never regained the right to claim self-defense. Therefore, the defense is unavailable to him. And so they move on to the second issue. The court also said that the castle doctrine is also unavailable to Peterson because he was the aggressor. Because D.C. encourages safe retreat in line with the minority view, the judge was correct in allowing the jury to consider Peterson's safe retreat options. And notice that the instructions just said that they could consider his ability to retreat safely. It didn't announce a requirement that he retreat safely if he could. So it was a pretty soft version of that, which was actually pretty pro-defendant. But they said the castle doctrine's unavailable because he was the aggressor and you don't get to invoke the castle doctrine if you're the aggressor. So finally, the holding. On the first issue, the court said that the judge properly instructed the jury and allowed them to decide whether Peterson provoked the conflict with Kite. And on the second issue, the court said that the trial judge properly instructed the jury that they may consider Peterson's ability to safely retreat in deciding whether he behaved reasonably. And because these two instructions were in line with the law, therefore, they upheld the conviction that was based on those jury instructions.